The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 1, Discovery and Early Planting. Chapter 11, Legacies, Jamestown and Plymouth, as well as Chapter 12, America's Early Roots. In reviewing the period of American discovery and its early planting, a clear contrast can be made between the first two permanent colonies, Virginia and Massachusetts, which formed jointly by the Pilgrims and Puritans. Each colony had a powerful impact on the nation, and each created a long-lasting legacy felt across the generations, but in dramatically different ways. Comparing the two illustrates how, in some respects, America became a tale of two cities, Jamestown and Plymouth. The Jamestown settlers grew up and came from a world radically different from anything to which Americans today are accustomed. There was no private property per se. The king claimed ownership of the land and would sometimes grant portions of it to lords and nobles, but he could always take it back and give it to someone else. Therefore, not only was all land in England his, but he likewise claimed ownership of America by right of English discovery. English subjects were at the mercy of the king, and as common legal phrase of that day explained, quote, "The king can do no wrong," end quote. English explorers Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh both served the British monarch. One had explored the west coast of America around 1579, the other the east coast around 1585. English rulers therefore viewed all land from the Atlantic westward to the Pacific as theirs. Thus, when the first colonists came to America from England, it never crossed their minds that the British king did not actually own the land. He said he did, and that ended the question. There was no need to approach the natives to ask permission to live there. Those Virginia colonists were also part of the official state-established Anglican Church of England. Because they relied heavily on state-appointed priests who told them how to interpret the Bible, they generally were not strong students of the Scriptures and its teachings. Most were professing Christians, but few knew the Bible well. As a result, religious toleration was less a part of their spiritual DNA than it was in New England. Additionally, the early colonists had limited trades and vocations, and what they did have was often assigned them by the government. What they produced was generally for the direct benefit of others, such as the king or nobles, and not themselves. They therefore relied heavily on government provision for their sustenance, and their general culture was socialistic, elitist, and monarchical. Because the Virginia settlers had lived their lives dependent on the bounty of the king, they were unprepared for the hard work necessary to survive in the new lands. Consequently, of the original 104 colonists who arrived in Jamestown, 2/3 were dead within 6 months. 2 years later, with the arrival of additional ships, the population had grown to 490, but only 60 survived the winter of 1609, which is called the Starving Time. Okay, at this time, like I did describing the Columbus cannibalism period, I'm going to skip half of page 75 of the book, which is an official who described the cannibalism that took place in the Jamestown colony. So we'll pick things back up again in page 76. The major reason for the starving time was Jamestown's socialistic system and lack of private property. Simply put, the colonists in Virginia had little incentive to work hard and improve the plots of land. Governor John Smith implemented a policy designed to combat their socialism, and it was drawn directly from the Bible, declaration that, quote, whoever would not work must not eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. He therefore placed squarely on the shoulders of every individual the necessity of being productive. The colony would provide charity for the sick, disabled, and elderly, but not the able-bodied. Every citizen must work for himself. If he did not, he would receive nothing. The Virginians fiercely resisted this policy, but historians affirm that, quote, it was the best law possible for such a time and place, end quote. When Smith returned to England after his injury in 1609, the colony reverted to socialism and widespread laziness, along with its accompanying problems. When Thomas Dale later became governor in 1616, he tried to get them back to work and thus, quote, ruled with a rod of iron. He enforced Smith's rule by whipping those who would not work, and he wisely began to break down the old system of holding all property in common, i.e., socialism. With the Jamestown colonists' general aversion to working for themselves and their desire to have others work and provide for them, it is not surprising that the Virginia colony is where chattel slavery first became legal in America. Chattel slavery is the complete and unlimited ownership of another person and their descendants. Other colonies formed in that region had a similar mindset. And in these southern colonies, slavery grew fastest and deepest. The southern propensity for slaves became so strong that during the American War for Independence, many Southerners were reluctant to serve in defense of America for fear that their slaves might escape. Great Britain saw the South's interest in slavery as a way to divide the Americans. So in late 1775, she, Great Britain, promised freedom to slaves who escaped and joined her. While some 100,000 slaves joined the British, only about 5,000 of them were actually freed, with most of the rest remaining in slavery with the British. In fact, the British forcibly seized and kept slaves to increase their own resources. The announced British plan had an opposite effect. It motivated many slave owners, including some Americans with British sympathies, to get involved in the fight in order to save slavery and their plantations. This is not to say that slavery was the primary cause of the War for Independence, as the New York Times 1619 Project has wrongly asserted. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Henry, Mason, and many other Southerners were patriots long before Great Britain tried to use slavery to divide the colonies. As will be shown later, anti-slavery sentiment drove many toward separation from Great Britain, even in the South. So many slaves were freed during the era of American independence that this period is sometimes called, quote, the first emancipation, end quote. Unfortunately, by the time Civil War commenced, the slavery mentality was so deeply entrenched in many Southerners that secession documents often cited the desire to preserve slavery as the primary reason for states leaving the Union. Some Southern apologists have argued that these states seceded for economic reasons or to preserve the state's sovereignty, but not slavery. While there were some economic policies that adversely impacted the South, simply put, the American Civil War would not have occurred if slavery had not been an issue. With the Virginia colony's early rejection of the equality of all individuals, it became logical to preserve the sort of class distinctions common in England. At the top were white elites, including plantation owners, government officials, who were often plantation owners, and ministers of the state church. Below this class were white citizens who owned small plots of land, followed then by common laborers. At the bottom were the free blacks, and lastly the slaves. The lower classes were expected to defer to their betters, and groups and labels became more important than individuals. Despite these gross errors in thinking and philosophy, Virginia nevertheless produced many outstanding leaders, including Reverend Samuel Davies, John Leland, and statesmen such as George Washington, James Madison, Patrick Henry, and George Mason. However, notwithstanding such outstanding contributions, Virginia also fomented the legalization and expansion of slavery, religious intolerance, and elitism. The Pilgrims and the Massachusetts colony produced a very different legacy. Citizens in these and other northern colonies found life no less challenging or dangerous than the southern colonists, and they too professed Christianity, just as those in Virginia had, but their thinking and behavior differed greatly. For one thing, they had a much greater personal knowledge of the Bible and its teachings. It was a constant emphasis for every individual Pilgrim and Puritan to personally know the Scriptures and conform to its teachings. They therefore strongly objected to state-run churches and were more supportive of the individual rights of religious conscience. When departures from religious tolerance did occur, they were relatively short-lived and quickly corrected. So, while the Virginia colony was professedly Christian, the colonies in what became Massachusetts strove to be biblical, which made a significant difference in behavior as well as public policy. For example, Virginia's first code of laws acknowledged the Scriptures in general, but cited no specific verses as the basis for its laws and policies. But the legal code in Massachusetts contained specific Scripture references accompanying the various provisions of the code. Also, the king gave the Pilgrim settlers some of his land in the New World, just as he had the Virginia settlers. But because the Pilgrims more fully understood the Bible's teachings on private property, they went directly to neighboring Indian tribes to purchase land from them at mutually agreed upon prices. Furthermore, when those in Plymouth faced a shortage of food, like that at Jamestown, they did not have to be whipped into working. They quickly recognized the shortcomings of socialism and voluntarily abandoned it, instituting elements of what became the free market economic system. In fact, the first free market business in America was a Pilgrim-run 1627 trading post at Aptuxet. Massachusetts became known for what was historically called, quote, the Puritan hard work ethic, end quote, and was the most productive of all the early American colonies. Additionally, in Massachusetts, education was required for all, no matter how poor or common they might be. And because these colonists were familiar with biblical teachings on the equality of all mankind, they saw chattel slavery as wrong. In 1641, man-stealing became a capital crime, punishable by death. Man-stealing, made a crime by Exodus 21:16 and 1 Timothy 1:10 in the Bible, was the forcible abduction of a person from their own country to send to another. Because of that law, in 1646, when a shipload of slaves arrived at Massachusetts, the colonists freed the slaves and imprisoned and punished the slave traders. Massachusetts permitted slavery in a narrow and very limited circumstances. But after independence, Massachusetts became the first state to completely abolish slavery. And by the time of the first national census in 1790, there was not a single slave in the state. In summary, much that was good in America came from the Plymouth colony and spread outward, and much that was detrimental came from the Jamestown colony, also spreading outward. In 1888, with America still deeply reeling from the direct and indirect effects of the Civil War, a wall map was published showing many of the fruits produced by the two models. That graphic showed God's blessings flowing outward from the biblical principles introduced in Plymouth, and God's curse moving outward from bad philosophy applied in Jamestown. While today both geographic areas of the nation are dramatically different from their current beliefs from their original views, the two dissimilar seeds early shown in America nevertheless produced indistinctly different thinking and behaviors that lasted for generations. In looking back over the period of American discovery and its early planting, it is clear that 1. The Christian faith and a knowledge of the Bible motivated many early explorers. 2. People who desired to freely worship the God of the Bible and practice biblical precepts founded and heavily populated the colonies. 3. Common schools began so that every individual would be able to read, study, and understand the Bible for themselves. And 4. Civil laws and constitutions relied greatly on Bible verses and ideas. Early America was irrefutably influenced by and founded on the teachings of the Bible and its general principles. In fact, the historical evidence is so overwhelming that even President Andrew Jackson, who did not become a Christian until shortly before his death, had earlier reached the obvious conclusion that, quote, "It, the Bible, is the rock on which our republic rests."